At 10:30 in the morning, under a broken gray sky over occupied Germany, one American fighter lagged behind its formation. It wasn't fast. It wasn't graceful. And it definitely wasn't the kind of aircraft pilots chose when survival mattered. By that moment, its airframe already carried more than 200 visible holes. Not scratches. Not dents. Holes. Some rounds had punched straight through the fuselage. Others had torn panels loose, leaving jagged metal vibrating in the slipster. Minutes earlier, the canopy was gone. Ripped away by a burst of gunfire that passed inches from the pilot's head. Freezing air flooded the cockpit. The aircraft shuddered unevenly, as if it might come apart at any second. German pilots saw it. Some caught brief glimpses as they passed. Others heard it over the radio. To them, this wasn't a fight anymore. It was just a matter of time. The American fighter was too large, too heavy, too slow to still be flying in that condition. It wasn't a question of if it would fall. Only when. Some German pilots broke off, already searching for new targets. Others stayed behind, not to attack, just to watch. It wasn't every day you saw a fighter this damaged. Still airborne. The aircraft was a P-47 Thunderbolt. Long before that morning. Before crossing the Atlantic. Before facing German fighters in combat. The P-47 carried a reputation. And it wasn't a good one. Inside American air bases, pilots had nicknames for it. Some called it the flying bathtub. Others didn't bother being polite. They said it was too big to dogfight. Too heavy to maneuver. Too slow to survive against agile enemy fighters. Compared to German aircraft, it looked like a mistake. A machine that had no business fighting modern air battles. Some pilots hated it openly. Others quietly requested transfers to different units. No speeches. No argument. NTS. Just paperwork. The unspoken rule was simple. If you were caught alone in a P-47, separated from your formation, your war would end right there. On that morning, that pilot was alone. The mission had started like dozens before it. Bomber escort. Long hours. Endless tension. Keeping the bombers alive meant keeping pressure on factories, rail lines, supply depots. The Germans knew that. They waited for it. When enemy fighters appeared, it wasn't cautious probing. It wasn't scattered attacks. It was coordinated. Fast. Aggressive. Designed to pull escorts away from the bombers and isolate them. Within minutes, the sky collapsed into chaos. Tracer fire crossed at impossible angles. Contrails twisted through cloud layers. Aircraft dove and climbed in violent bursts of speed. The P-47 moved in to draw fire. Not because it was ideal. Because someone had to do it. The pilot dove. Fired. Climbed again. The Thunderbolt absorbed the first hits like blows against thick armor. The engine kept running. The controls still answered. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Then the concentrated fire arrived. Long bursts tore through the wings. The instrument panel partially shattered. Needles spinning uselessly. A heavy impact ripped away what remained of the canopy. The pilot was suddenly exposed. Wind. Cold. Flying debris. Another hit crippled the hydraulic system. Warning lights flickered. Control stiff. Ned. Every correction now required for CE. And still, the P-47 stayed airborne. That was the contradiction. Any other fighter in that condition would have spiraled down. Or broken apart. This one didn't. It pressed on like a wounded slab of steel. Slow. Damaged. Stubbornly alive. From the German perspective, it looked like an error. A delay between cause and effect that shouldn't exist. Combat doctrine said it was impossible. Inside the open cockpit, the reality was simpler. There was no backup plan. The pilot knew he couldn't rejoin the formation. He knew he couldn't win a conventional fight. Every second in the air increased the odds of another hit. But abandoning the aircraft now meant death. The altitude was wrong. The position was wrong. And the territory below was enemy held. In that moment, the war collapsed into a single equation. Either this aircraft could endure far more than anyone believed. Or there would be no return. Everything said it shouldn't endure. The Thunderbolt had been mocked before the war. During training. During its first missions. Many said it survived only by flying straight. Trusting armor instead of skill. It wasn't the kind of aircraft that created legends. It was the kind that became a statistic. Now, in a sky filled with metal and wind, one pilot was about to find out whether those judgments were right. Or whether this so-called useless fighter hid something no one had accounted for when they laughed at it on the ground. Because at that moment, the P-47 didn't need to be fast. It didn't need to be elegant. It didn't need to win the fight. It needed only to refuse to die. And no one, on either side of the sky, believed it could. The problem wasn't just the damage. The problem was the aircraft itself. The P-47 Thunderbolt had never been designed to fight the way this battle was unfolding. It was built around one thing above all else: a massive engine. That engine made the aircraft powerful, but it also made it heavy. Fully loaded, the P-47 weighed several thousand pounds more than most German fighters. That weight came with consequences. It didn't turn well at low speed, it didn't climb quickly, and once it lost energy, it was supposed to die. German pilots knew this. They trained for it. Their fighters were lighter, more agile, and designed for close-range maneuvering. They thrived in turning fights. The P-47 did not. Inside American units, this wasn't a secret. Pilots joked that the Thunderbolt wasn't a fighter at all. It was a bomber escort that happened to have guns. 8 of them. Heavy machine guns mounted in thick wings. Plenty of firepower, but firepower didn't matter if you couldn't stay alive long enough to use it. The aircraft relied on speed and altitude to survive. Lose either one, and you were finished. Now consider the pilot's situation. He wasn't at altitude anymore. He wasn't fast. And his aircraft was wounded. The hydraulic system was failing. That meant flaps were unreliable, control surfaces were heavy. Every maneuver now required strength. Physical effort. Not finesse. The open cockpit made it worse. Without the canopy, wind battered his face, cold air numbed his hands, noise drowned out subtle engine cues. Even simple tasks, checking instruments, maintaining Henning, became harder. And then there was the fuel. The Thunderbolt burned fuel quickly. The longer he stayed in combat, the less range he had to make it home. This wasn't just a fight. It was a countdown. German pilots understood the math. They didn't need to shoot him down immediately. They only needed to keep pressure on him. Force maneuvers, force mistakes. Eventually, the heavy American fighter would bleed speed, then altitude, then options. That was how these fights ended. Almost every time. The P-47 was supposed to survive only under one condition. It had to stay high, and it had to stay fast. This aircraft was neither. From a technical standpoint, the outcome was obvious. The aircraft had taken catastrophic damage. Its aerodynamics were compromised, its systems were failing, its pilot was exposed and fatigued. And the enemy still had numbers. Multiple fighters, fresh, undamaged. From a human standpoint, it was worse. The pilot had been trained for formation flying, for escort, for disengaging at altitude. Not for surviving alone inside a broken aircraft while being hunted. There was no manual for this situation. No checklist. No training exercise that covered it. Every instinct said the same thing. This should not work. The aircraft was wrong for the fight, the conditions were wrong, the damage was terminal. If the pilot climbed, the engine might fail. If he turned hard, the wings might not hold. If he dove, control could be lost completely. Every option carried risk. Lethal risk. And yet, the Thunderbolt was still flying. Not gracefully, not efficiently, but stubbornly. The German pilots noticed that too. The aircraft didn't break apart. It didn't spiral down. It absorbed punishment and kept going. That was unexpected. Confusing. And confusion, in combat, is dangerous. Because doctrine only works when reality behaves. This one wasn't. The heavy American fighter refused to do what it was supposed to do. And the longer it stayed in the air, the more time the pilot had to make a decision. Not a clever one. Not an elegant one. Just the right one. What happened next would decide whether the Thunderbolt finally became the statistic everyone expected. Or something far worse for the men hunting it. The moment of truth didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. The pilot knew something the German fighters didn't. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn. It wasn't built to dance in tight circles. But it was built to do one thing extremely well. Dive. The aircraft's massive engine gave it tremendous weight. That weight was a weakness in a turning fight. But in a dive, it became an advantage. The pilot felt the aircraft responding differently the moment he committed. He lowered the nose. Not sharply. Not aggressively. Just enough. The damaged fighter began to accelerate. Air rushed faster through the open cockpit. The wind pressed harder against his chest. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful. But it was fast when gravity helped. German pilots saw the move and reacted instinctively. They followed. They always followed. In their experience, heavy American fighters broke apart under stress. If they dove too hard, wings failed. If they went too fast, control was lost. This one should have done the aim. It didn't. The P-47 picked up speed smoothly. The controls were heavy, but predictable. The pilot kept the dive shallow enough to maintain control, but steep enough to build ants. For the first time since the engagement began, the distance between him and the enemy increased instead of shrinking. That mattered. Because distance bought time. And time bought tie-ins. One German fighter stayed with him. Just one. Confident. Aggressive. The pilot could see it clearly now, closing from behind and above. The German believed the American was unning. He wasn't. The pilot waited. Not seconds. Longer. He let the aircraft accelerate until the controls felt almost solid in his hands. Until the airframe vibrated at a constant pitch. Until the pursuing fighter committed fully to the chase. Then the pilot did something the German did not expect. He pulled. Not hard. Not suddenly. Just enough to bring the Thunderbolt's nose up and across the attacker's path. The aircraft responded slowly. But it responded. The German fighter overshot. Only for a moment. But that moment was enough. The pilot pressed the trigger. 8 machine guns spoke a T once. The distance was short. The burst was controlled. The German fighter shuddered, then snapped violently sideways. Debris flashed past the Thunderbolt. The enemy aircraft rolled, dropped, and disappeared. Below. The pilot did not watch it fall. He didn't have time. Because the dive had carried him lower. And lower altitude brought new danger. But something had changed. For the first time, the pilot wasn't simply reacting. He had acted. And it worked. The German pilots noticed. They had followed doctrine. They had followed experience. And one of them had not come back. The American fighter was still damaged. Still slow to respond. Still bleeding systems. But it had just demonstrated something unexpected. It could still fight. That realization spread quickly through the enemy formation. The remaining fighters adjusted their spacing. Their approach angles changed. They were no longer rushing in blindly. They were STUDing. That was the first real victory. Not the kill. The doubt. The pilot felt it too. Not confidence. Not relief. Just clarity. The Thunderbolt couldn't win this fight by playing the enemy's game. But it didn't of A2. It only needed to survive long enough to force the Germans to make the next move. And they would. Because now they knew something was wrong. And when hunters realize their prey doesn't behave as expected, they become dangerous. The victory lasted seconds. Almost immediately after the German fighter went down, the situation worsened. The dive that had saved him carried the Thunderbolt lower than planned. Much lower. The pilot checked his instruments. Altitude was bleeding away faster than expected. Fuel pressure fluctuated. The engine temperature crept upward. The aircraft was still flying. But it was no longer forgiven. That was when the remaining German fighters changed tactics. They stopped chasing blindly. They spread instead of attacking from behind. They began approaching from the sides and below. Angles designed not to destroy the aircraft, but to kill the pill. The pilot felt the first close pass before he fully saw it. A blur of motion. A flash of metal. Rounds snapped past the cockpit. One struck the fuselage just below his left shoulder. Another punched through the wing root. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently. The controls went momentarily SL. For a fraction of a second, the aircraft stopped responding. That was the most dangerous moment. Not the damage. Not the enemy. The silence between input and RESP. Once. The pilot forced himself not to overcorrect. He held pressure. Wah! Aight. The controls came back heavy, delayed, but alive. The aircraft leveled just above the tree. Tops. Now the danger multiplied. At low altitude, there was no margin. No room to dive. No room to trade speed for space. Every mistake would be final. The German pilots knew this too. They pressed harder. One fighter slashed across the Thunderbolt's nose, firing at point-blank range. The pilot ducked instinctively. Another pass came from below. Rounds tore through the underside of the fuse. Lage. The cockpit filled with the smell of burned oil and hot metal. The wind howled louder as more skin peeled away. The Thunderbolt was becoming less an aircraft and more a collection of parts flying in forma. Tie-in. Then the engine coughed. Once. Twice. The pilot felt his stomach tighten. If the engine failed at this altitude, there would be no recovery. No glide. No BA. Ill out. He eased the throttle back slightly. Not because it was safe. Because it was necessary. The vibration smoothed marginally. The engine stabilized. B. A rally. The German fighters circled. They didn't rush now. They waited for the moment. The stall. The engine failure. The mistake. This was no longer a chase. It was an execution delayed by stub. Orness. The pilot understood that clearly. Staying low meant certain death. Climbing meant risking structural failure. Turning tightly meant losing control. Every option was bad. He needed something else. Something the enemy wasn't expecting. That was when he noticed the pattern. The German fighters were careful now. Too careful. They respected the Thunderbolt's firepower after losing one of their own. They were staying just outside effective gun range. Probing. Testing. That caution created space. Not much. But enough. The pilot made his decision. It wasn't safe. It wasn't recommended. And it definitely wasn't in any training manual. He pushed the throttle forward again. Not to climb. Not to turn. But to build speed along the ground. The Thunderbolt surged forward, skimming dangerously close to the terrain. Trees flashed past beneath the wings. The margin for error shrank to nothing. The German fighters hesitated. Only briefly. But that hesitation mattered. Because now the fight had changed again. The pilot wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to force the enemy into a mistake. Before the aircraft finally gave up. And somewhere behind him, the German pilots realized this was no longer routine. They weren't hunting a broken aircraft anymore. They were being drawn into something unpredictable. That realization came too late. The fight stopped being chaotic. And that was dangerous. Both sides had learned something. The German pilots had learned the Thunderbolt would not fall easily. The American pilot had learned the Germans would not rush again. That mutual understanding changed everything. The air around the Thunderbolt felt different now. Less frantic. more deliberate. The German fighters no longer attacked in pairs. They stopped crossing behind each other. They stopped firing long bursts. Instead, they began spacing themselves. Each aircraft held position just outside the Thunderbolt's effective firing arc. Close enough to threaten. Far enough to survive. They were no longer trying to overwhelm the aircraft. They were trying to manage it. From the pilot's perspective, this was worse. Before, the danger had been obvious. Now it was subtle. The German fighters waited for the Thunderbolt to make a mistake. A stall. A climb that bled speed. A turn that demanded more control than the aircraft could give. The pilot could feel the aircraft deteriorating. Not dramatically. Incrementally. The controls required more pressure than before. The engine response lagged slightly after throttle changes. The vibration pattern had shifted again. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was cumulative. This was the kind of damage that didn't kill you instantly. It waited. The pilot kept the Thunderbolt low. Not because it was safe. Because it limited the enemy's options. At altitude, the Germans could dive freely. They could reset the fight again and again. Near the ground, every maneuver carried consequence. But staying low came with its own price. There was no room left. No vertical escape. No forgiveness. The duel had begun. Not between machines. Between decisions. The German fighters tested him. One would edge closer from the left. Another would drop slightly below his nose. Never committing. Always watching. The pilot resisted the urge to react. Every instinct told him to turn toward the nearest threat. He ignored it. Turning tightly would cost speed. Speed was life. Instead, he held a shallow, uneven course. Not straight. Not predictable. Small adjustments. Enough to signal awareness. Not enough to give an opening. The Germans adjusted again. They began alternating pressure. One fighter would close just enough to force attention. When the Thunderbolt shifted slightly to track it, another would move. It was deliberate. Calculated. They were trying to overload the pilot. Force him to divide focus. The pilot felt fatigue creeping in. Not physical exhaustion. Mental. The constant evaluation. The constant restraint. Every second required judgment. Every second without a mistake felt like borrowed time. Then one of the German fighters made a small error. It wasn't obvious. Barely noticeable. The aircraft closed its distance just a fraction too much. Not enough for a clean shot, but enough to reduce its own margin. The pilot noticed. He didn't react immediately. He waited. He let the German believe the approach had gone unnoticed. The Thunderbolt continued on its uneven path. The German fighter edged closer. Confident now. That confidence was the opening. The pilot adjusted his throttle by a small amount. Not to accelerate. To change timing. The German fighter's closure rate changed unexpectedly. Not dramatically. Just enough. The spacing collapsed. For a brief moment, the German aircraft drifted into a position it hadn't planned. Too close. Too committed. The pilot began his turn. Not a tight turn. A wide, dragging arc. The kind the Thunderbolt could manage without tearing itself apart. The German pilot reacted late. He had expected hesitation. He got movement. The Thunderbolt's nose crossed the German's flight path. Not perfectly, but close enough. The pilot fired a short burst. Not to kill, to force reaction. The German fighter broke away sharply. The opportunity vanished. No kill. No debris. No confirmation. But the message was clear. The Thunderbolt was not passive. It was watching. Waiting. Adapting. The German pilots pulled back slightly. Spacing increased again. The duel reset. But something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about waiting for the American to fail. It was about avoiding being the one who failed first. And in that kind of fight, the next mistake wouldn't be small. It would be fatal. The weight that had been a weakness became force. The German fighter closest to him reacted late. It had committed to the climb. Now it was slow. Exposed. The Thunderbolt crossed beneath it. Not cleanly. Not elegantly. But close enough. The pilot fired. A short burst. Controlled. The round struck the German fighter along the fuselage and wing root. The aircraft snapped sideways. Smoke trailed instantly. It did not explode. It simply stopped being part of the fight. The remaining German pilots broke formation. Not retreating. Reassessing. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Thunderbolt was damaged. Slow. Outnumbered. It had no right to force a kill like that. The pilot didn't pursue. He couldn't. The aircraft was shaking harder now. The engine temperature was climbing again. But the balance had shifted. The Germans were no longer controlling the engagement. They were reacting to it. The pilot leveled out. Low. Fast. Unpredictable. He didn't look back. He didn't count victories. He focused on one thing. Staying alive long enough to make them hesitate again. Because hesitation was now his weapon. And the German pilots felt it. They widened their spacing once more. Their attacks became less coordinated. Less confident. The Thunderbolt had done something no one expected. It had turned the hunt into a negotiation. And in that negotiation, the next mistake would decide everything. The aircraft was running out of time. The pilot didn't need instruments to know it. He could feel it. In the vibration. In the sluggish response of the controls. In the way the engine no longer sounded consistent. The Thunderbolt was still flying. But it was flying on borrowed tolerance. The pilot checked his altitude again. Low. Lower than before. The terrain rushed beneath him faster now, trees and fields blurring together. There was no room left to descend. And climbing was becoming less reliable by the second. The engine temperature needle crept higher. The pilot eased the throttle back slightly. Not because it was safe. Because pushing it further might end everything. Behind him, the German fighters regrouped. They were fewer now. More cautious. But still dangerous. They didn't rush. They didn't swarm. They followed at distance, watching the Thunderbolt struggle. Waiting for the moment when physics finally won. The pilot understood the danger clearly. If they attacked together again, he would not survive. The aircraft couldn't absorb much more. He needed to end this. Not with a victory. With an escape. The problem was simple. To escape, he needed speed. To gain speed, he needed to dive. But diving now meant risking structural failure. The airframe was already compromised. Another high-speed dive could tear it apart. The pilot hesitated. That hesitation nearly killed him. One of the German fighters closed suddenly from above and behind. Faster than before. Closer than expected. The pilot saw it late. Too late for a clean reaction. Tracer rounds flashed past the cockpit. One struck the wingtip. Another tore through the fuselage just behind the seat. The Thunderbolt lurched violently. The controls went momentarily numb. For a fraction of a second, the aircraft stopped responding entirely. That was the edge. The point where survival ended and falling began. The pilot forced the stick forward instinctively. Not with precision. With desperation. The nose dipped. The aircraft responded, slowly, reluctantly. The dive began. Wind roared through the open cockpit. The airframe screamed under stress. The pilot held the controls steady. Any sudden input now could finish the aircraft. The Thunderbolt accelerated. The terrain rushed closer. Faster. Faster. The German fighters followed. They believed this was the end. A broken aircraft diving itself apart. But the Thunderbolt did not disintegrate. It held. Barely. The speed built rapidly. The engine howled. The pilot's vision narrowed slightly at the edges. He resisted the urge to pull up too early. If he did, the aircraft would stall. If he waited too long, he would hit the ground. This was the smallest margin of the entire fight. At the last possible moment, the pilot eased back on the controls. Not sharply. Not forcefully. Just enough. The Thunderbolt leveled out only a few dozen feet above the ground. Close enough that the pilot could see individual trees flash past. The German fighters did not follow as cleanly. One pulled up too hard. Another leveled out too early. Their formation broke. The pilot didn't turn. Didn't look back. He stayed low. He stayed fast. The Thunderbolt was no longer a target. It was an object moving too quickly, too unpredictably to intercept safely. Behind him, the German fighters disengaged. Not because they had been defeated. Because the risk had shifted. The pilot felt it immediately. The pressure lifted. The sky behind him emptied. He was alone again. But this time, that was a relief. The aircraft was still damaged. Still bleeding systems. Still one failure away from disaster. But the fight was over. The Thunderbolt had survived what it was never meant to survive. And now, the pilot faced a final challenge. Getting home. Getting home was not immediate. With the German fighters gone, the pilot eased the Thunderbolt upward, carefully. Very carefully. The aircraft responded unevenly. The controls lagged. The engines sounded strained. Every adjustment felt like a negotiation. He did not climb to altitude. He stayed low. Low enough to avoid stressing the airframe further. Low enough to keep speed without forcing the engine. The flight back felt longer than the entire fight. Minutes stretched. Every vibration raised out. The pilot scanned the instruments repeatedly. Fuel pressure held. Oil temperature remained high but stable. The engine did not quit. When the airfield finally appeared ahead, the pilot did not feel relief. Not yet. Landing would be the most dangerous part. The Thunderbolt was heavy. Its hydraulics were damaged. Flaps were unreliable. A hard landing could tear the aircraft apart. The pilot lined up carefully. No last-minute corrections. No sharp inputs. The wheels touched down harder than normal. The aircraft bounced once. Then settled. The Thunderbolt rolled to a stop. The engine sputtered. And then went silent. Only then did the pilot sit back. Only then did the tension leave his body. Ground crews reached the aircraft almost immediately. They stopped short when they saw it. The damage was worse up close. Panels missing. Control surfaces torn. Dozens of holes visible at a glance. Maintenance crews counted them. Then counted again. More than 200 confirmed impacts. Some had passed through critical structures. Some had narrowly missed the cockpit. By every standard measure, the aircraft should not have returned. Reports were written. Photographs were taken. The aircraft was examined in detail. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Thunderbolt had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Not through agility. Not through elegance. Through structure. Through mass. Through durability. The pilot was debriefed. He described the fight plainly. No embellishment. No dramatics. Just decisions. Distances. Timing. What mattered wasn't the kills. What mattered was what had worked. The engagement became a reference point. Not a legend. A case study. Engineers and tacticians took note. The P-47's strengths were re-evaluated. Its survivability was no longer an inconvenience. It was an asset. Pilots were briefed differently. They were taught not to force the Thunderbolt into fights it wasn't designed for. And not to underestimate what it was designed to endure. The aircraft that had once been mocked became respected. Not loved. Respected. As for the pilot, he flew again. He did not retire. He did not stop trusting the aircraft. But he never forgot the margin. The narrow band between control and failure. That day proved something important. Doctrine works until it doesn't. Training matters until it no longer applies. In combat, survival often depends on recognizing when rules no longer fit reality. The Thunderbolt survived not because it followed doctrine, but because one pilot understood when to abandon it. This was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was a sequence of decisions made under impossible pressure. And it left behind a simple truth. In war, the manual can fail. The aircraft can be wrong. The situation can be unwinnable. But sometimes, one decision is enough. This is why these stories matter. Not because they glorify war, but because they show what happens when doctrine fails.